The 17th century, as we have already seen, was marked by a series of crises throughout the European continent. In a sense, the crises of the 17th century, which in Europe, a pan-European phenomenon, were still continuing in the eastern half of the continent, where the situation did not really begin to stabilize until 1711. Now, this period was characterized by something called the Great Northern War. And this Great Northern War marked the final stage in a centuries-long struggle in the north, hence the Great Northern War, between Muscovy and Sweden for control of the Baltic Sea, and also a continuation on the part of Muscovy in the south against the Ottoman Empire for access to the Black Sea. In short, Muscovy, medieval Muscovy, the northern parts of the old Kyivan Rus Federation, was a landlocked country, desperate for ports. The only one that it had initially was way up in the White Sea, but it's frozen for at least half of the year. So they really had no access to the sea, and therefore one of its major foreign policy goals throughout this early period of its history into the early modern era was to gain access to the Baltic Sea, in which they clashed then with Sweden, and access to the Black Sea, the warm water ports of the Black Sea, controlled by the Ottoman Empire. So that's the story of Muscovy, moving to the directly west, the Baltic Sea, and then south toward the Black Sea. Caught in the middle of these monumental conflicts was Ukraine. Now, the intensity of the military and political struggle during at least Eastern Europe's last 17th century crisis, that intensity was heightened by the presence of highly dynamic, young, and talented leaders who ruled two of the great powers in question, and that was Charles XII of Sweden and Peter I of Muscovy, also known in Western sources as Peter the Great. The contemporary, or their contemporary in Ukraine, was a man named Ivan Mazepa. Ivan Mazepa, himself an experienced, very capable leader, but a little bit older than the other two, and quite older. He held the post of Hetman of Ukraine from 1687 to 1708. And next to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Mazepa is the most influential of all Cossack leaders. Controversial period, controversial figure. Traditionally, this Mazepa has been viewed by Russian imperial historians, that was the imperial era, and to quote one of the most widely read and influential, Vasily Klyuchevsky, he classifies Mazepa very simply as a traitor. This is because he deserted Peter I at a critical moment and allied himself with Sweden's Charles XII. And therefore he's a traitor. Of course, such a view is based on the assumption that Ukraine was an integral part of the Russian Empire or of one and indivisible Muscovite Russian state, and that therefore Mazepa's turn to an external invader was a treasonous act. By the way, the public at large throughout the Russian Empire, the rest of the 18th, certainly 19th century, was influenced even more by the words of Russia's greatest writer. It's kind of its national bard, the 19th century poet Aleksandr Pushkin. Wrote a very well-known poem called Poltava. We'll see why Poltava is important. And in this poem, he referred to Mazepa as a Judas and as a snake. By the way, in the 20th century, some Russian historians modified those views. For instance, the emigre Russian scholar Mikhail Florinsky, writing in 1953, concluded, and I quote, "Mazepa, a traitor and a villain, according to official Russian historiography, was motivated by the legitimate and honorable desire to safeguard the authority of his country and to save it from destruction by siding with the probable winner. Although his methods were those of the most unscrupulous politician." Well, what do you want? Politicians are politicians. They have to do what they have to do. Soviet writers, whether Ukrainian or Russian, continue to propagate the traditional Russian imperialist conception. And so, for instance, in the third volume of the Soviet Encyclopedia of the History of Ukraine, the entry on Mazepa begins with a terse and uncompromising statement. Ivan Stepanovich Mazepa, hetman of the left bank Ukraine, traitor of the Ukrainian people. Now, Mazepa's image was also, at least initially, unfavorable among Ukrainian historians as well, especially those of the populist school during the second half of the 19th century. They also, in a sense, considered Mazepa a traitor, not with regard to Russia, but rather because he ostensibly acted primarily in the interests of the Cossack elite and not in the interests of the people of Ukraine as a whole. Those views began to change, however, so that by the 20th century, for some, Mazepa became the subject of uncritical praise, panegyrics. In the end, he was transformed into, quote unquote, the symbol of the struggle for the independence of Ukraine. Post-1991 independent Ukraine also considers Mazepa a national hero and has placed his portrait on one of its widely used banknotes. See, a little bit of diverse views of this character. Well, just to add to the picture very briefly, he became well known in Western Europe already in the late 18th century. Why? Because none other than the French philosopher Voltaire wrote two studies about the Great Northern War in which Mazepa figures prominently and not necessarily negatively. But in particular, Mazepa became a hero for the Romantic movement, not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. And he is the subject of none other than Lord Byron in England, who wrote a great epic poem called Mazepa, Victor Hugo in France, Julius Słowatsky in Poland, all composed poetic works entitled Mazepa, which were based on legendary tales associated with him. And there are some salacious details when he's growing up and falls in love and all of this kind of stuff. Great source of information for romantic writers. Not only writers, not one, not two, 3 operas were written entitled Mazepa, the most famous being by Pyotr Tchaikovsky. Cantatas for music by an Irish composer and a Spanish composer, a piano work by the German Löwe. But perhaps the best-known musical work was the tone poem for orchestra, also called Mazepa, by the Hungarian Franz Liszt. Clearly, this is a well-known figure, probably among the most well-known figures in European circumstances, someone from Ukraine. And then who was he? He clearly was controversial. And how did his career, in real terms, affect developments in Ukraine? Well, he was born sometime between 1629 and 1632, a town called Bila Tserkva, southwest of Kiev, the right bank, Ukraine. His father, Stepan Mazepa, was among the Orthodox Rus noblemen of Ukraine, so he has an aristocratic lineage. And his father joined the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1648, and then it became, during that Khmelnytsky period, a commander of the Cossack forces in his native region. His mother, too, was descended from an old Rus noble family. Later in life, she became a cultural and religious activist in her own right. Coming from such circumstances, this young Mazepa received a solid education at the Mohyla Collegium in Kiev. We discussed that institution, and it'll come up again. And then in 1649, at the height of the Khmelnytsky uprising, the young Mazepa was sent to the Jesuit college in Warsaw in order, according to his father, that he might learn behavior from people in the king's entourage. Actually, Poland's king at the time, recently elected. Remember, the king died in the first year of the Khmelnytsky uprising. Now we have this new king, Jan Kazimir. He's interested in creating a circle of young, pro-Polish, Orthodox Rus from Ukraine. And before long, Mazepa becomes the king's page, or gentleman in waiting. So he's at the highest level of Polish society. The king even paid for his travel and education abroad, the famous tour, the grand tour of Europe. And for 3 years, he was in Germany, Italy, and France. And when he returned from Western Europe, Mazepa entered the service of the king, the Polish king, especially on a diplomatic mission to the Cossacks. Well prepared. His early career reflected the rapidly changing political climate during the period of ruin. He began, as we've just seen, in the service of the Polish king. Then he served Poland's right bank hetman, this Petro Doroshenko that I mentioned last time, during the period of ruin, who eventually allied himself with the Ottoman Empire. So, service of Poland, service indirectly of the Ottoman Empire. And finally, Mazepa allied himself with Muscovy, which arranged in 1687 That's why we have this date up here. Why? Because Muscovy arranged to have Ivan Mazepa appointed hetman of the Cossack state in left bank Ukraine, which now became known as the hetmanate, the Cossack hetmanate, very clearly on this map. Now, from the very beginning of his tenure as hetman, Mazepa was not trusted by the Cossacks. Initially, he had no local power base. I mean, he didn't function in the hetmanate. I mean, he was in the service of the Polish king for most of his life. And in fact, he was viewed by the established Cossack starshina. We've mentioned it numerous times. We know what it is. Cossack elite, the Cossack officer corps. And he was viewed by them as an upstart and a foreigner from Poland. But Mazepa was a master of political intrigue, and before long he was able to create a small coterie of staunch supporters within the hetmanate. These staunch supporters consisted mainly of some members of the Cossack elite, the starshina, and in particular hierarchs, bishops, archbishops, metropolitans of the Orthodox Church. He befriended these people. It helped that he was able to enrich them with large land grants, whether the secular starshina or the Orthodox Church. Now, I mentioned Muscovy. Why was Mazepa helped by Muscovy? Well, he got appointed by them in 1687. They thought he was a malleable type. And on an official visit 2 years later in Moscow, he witnessed a palace revolution that deposed the ruling Tsarina named Sophia and brought her younger brother, half-brother, Sophia's half-brother, and political rival, this Peter I, to the throne. Mazepa, witnessing all of this, knows how to operate within the court systems of royalty. He quickly befriends Peter. He sees where the wind is blowing. And this young Peter, in turn, came to develop a strong liking and a trust in this older Cossack, certainly experienced politician. Because Mazepa enjoyed the confidence of the new Tsar Peter, when Mazepa returned home and in the following year was subjected to continual intrigue by his political rivals, of which there were many, and as Cossack leaders, they employed the Cossack privilege, which had become common practice, of sending denunciations against their leader, the hetman, directly to the Tsar. But Peter just simply rejected outright all such attacks. For his part, Mazepa served Peter faithfully in his anti-Ottoman Turkish wars in the south, and in turn received the Tsar's loyalty and friendship, including lavish gifts and land grants. So that as hetman, Ivan Mazepa was able to survive all the attempts of his Cossack rivals to unseat him. At least until 1700, the relations between Mazepa and Peter I were as good as they had ever been between any hetman and any Tsar. Now, while Mazepa managed to placate some, but not all, of the Cossack Starshina. Another source of anti-hetman activity was the Zaporozhian siege, Zaporozhye to the south of the hetmanate. Now, in theory, the land of Zaporozhye was dependent on both the hetman and the Tsar. Practically, however, Zaporozhye was, as always, wanted to be and was beyond the administrative jurisdiction of the hetmanate, and in practice followed its own autonomous. It did what it wanted. The Zaporozhian Cossacks in the siege generally had opposed hetmans, regardless whether they were hetman in the right bank, Poland, the left bank, Muscovy. Zaporozhians always suspected the Cossack Starshina of fostering their own aristocratic ambitions at the expense of the rank-and-file Cossacks, such as those in Zaporozhye. In fact, we already saw how the Cossacks in Zaporozhye siege remained an implacable foe of Poland, were opposed to any ideas of renewed Polish role in Ukraine, which some of Khmelnytsky's successors had actually favored. So you can't trust the Cossack Starshina from the standpoint of the Zaporozhians. And as a result of this, in particular their strong anti-Polish views, Zaporozhye nominally remained in the pro-Muscovite camp. So usually the equation, Zaporozhians, pro-Muscovites, at least for most of the 17th century. But gradually, this pro-Muscovite attitude on the part of the Cossacks of Zaporozhye began to change. Why? Because of Muscovy's anti-Ottoman and anti-Crimean campaigns. Remember, Muscovy wanted to get access to the Black Sea, warm water ports. And as paradoxical as it may seem, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who actually had come into existence because of the need to protect themselves against the Crimean Tatar and Nogai Tatar raids, now, at the end of the 17th century, they're beginning to be dissatisfied with Muscovy's concerted efforts to destroy the Crimean Khanate. After all, the Tatar threat was in itself a justification for the very existence of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. If there would be no more Crimean Tatar threat, then Muscovy would have no more need of its Zaporozhian frontier defenders. And it is in this context that the sparsely settled, still largely wild environment of the steppe, with potentially lucrative booty in Crimea just to the south, was something that the Cossacks of Zaporozhye wanted to preserve. Don't take those Crimean Tatars in the Khanate away. Now, Muscovy's next move in its effort to subdue the Crimean Khanate and to gain access to the Black Sea and, of course, the other sea, the Sea of Azov, came in 1695. This time, the Zaporozhians participated with Mazepa and the Muscovites in an attack on the powerful Ottoman Turkish fortress at the mouth of the Don River called Azov, or in Turkish Azak. It was a major battle. And Took a long time. Muscovites weren't successful in the beginning, but eventually they took the fortress in 1696 and signed with the Ottoman Empire a 30-year truce in 1700. And as a result of that truce and then treaty, Muscovy seemed to have finally gained access at least to the Sea of Azov, and that then would allow them to get into the Black Sea. What did this mean? Tsar Peter now felt that he was free to turn to his other, or Muscovy's other historical goal, the Baltic Sea in the north. By the way, speaking about young, dynamic characters, Charles XII and Peter, he was the first Tsar to travel to Western Europe. Particularly, he was fascinated by what he saw in Holland and in England. He worked on the docks, incognito, and he was determined to adapt Western technology, if you will, to the antiquated Muscovite governmental and social structure. He also saw Western Europe, again, in particular its technology, as a means of modernizing the Muscovite army and therefore making it possible to fulfill his ongoing dream of military conquest. The Baltic Sea in the north symbolically became Peter's quote-unquote window to the west. And to stress that new orientation, he planned to build a new capital for the Tsardom of Muscovy on the marshes of the Neva River near the Gulf of Finland, which flows into the Baltic Sea. But first, he had to get control of the Baltic Sea coast, and that still remained in the hands of the most powerful Northern European state, Sweden. And so he set out to create diplomatic alliances together with Sweden's traditional enemies. That was Denmark, directly to the south of Sweden, and Poland, ruled at the time by a man named August, or from the Germanic state of Saxony. This August was originally just recently elected king of Poland, and you know, in the Polish system, they were elected kings. And he promised to involve Poland on the side of Muscovy, should that be necessary. And so by the year 1700, all sides were preparing for the outbreak of what later came to be known as the Great Northern War. Despite an impressive diplomatic and military alliance on his side, Peter soon discovered that he had a formidable foe in the 27-year-old, get this, not much older than you sitting in this room, the 27-year-old Charles XII of Sweden. Charles invaded Poland. 2 years later, he captured Warsaw and Krakow, the current and historic capitals of Poland. Many Polish nobles, always moving for the king, against the king, many Polish nobles gave their support to Charles, the King of Sweden. And Sweden even proposed its own candidate to take the royal crown of Poland, a man named Stanisław Leszczyński. it's at this point that Ivan Mazepa and his Cossack army were drawn directly into the conflict. Fearing that his ally, Poland's King August, would be completely overwhelmed by Swedish forces and their Polish allies, Tsar Peter needed to act quickly. He desperately wanted to preserve the existence of a Polish kingdom, but a Polish kingdom that would remain opposed to Sweden, so he gave all the support to King August. And in that context, he ordered Mazepa in 1705 to cross over from the left bank across the fixed boundary into Poland, into the right bank Ukraine, formerly under Polish rule, in an attempt to give support to the king of Poland, that August was pro-Muscovite. And Mazepa promptly did this, always loyal to Peter, and in a sense occupied the largely Ukrainian-inhabited Polish Palatinates of Kiev and farther west, Volhynia. For the next 2 years, 1705, 1706, Mazepa controls the right bank, and in that sense, he unites much of Ukrainian territory under his hetmanate. The local Cossacks in right bank Ukraine welcomed the fact that Mazepa had driven out the Poles, although Tsar Peter now expected the region to be returned to his Polish ally. But Mazepa had other plans. This long-time reliance on Muscovy on the part of the Cossack hetmanate, certainly since the outbreak of the Great Northern War in 1700, proved to be very costly. More than 40,000 Cossacks had been sent into battle. The annual casualty rates in some regiments were as high as 60 and 70%. The Cossacks were also apprehensive of Peter's plans to reorganize them and to send them to Prussia for training as foot soldiers. Order, discipline. This is what he learned in Western Europe. This obviously doesn't fit well with the Zaporozhian Cossacks or any Cossacks. And finally, the civilian population in Cossack Ukraine was deeply discontent. Between 1705 and 1708, both the hetman and the Tsar received numerous complaints from peasants, from townspeople about the abusive conduct of Muscovite officers and troops on the hetmanate territory of Ukraine. All of these factors contributed to an atmosphere in which some of his closest advisors, that is Mazepa's closest advisors, began to have serious doubts about the advantages of remaining an ally of Muscovy. Most especially when now we have this strong power, Sweden, under this dynamic king, young King Charles XII, who now seemed to be really the dominant force on the Eastern European scene. In fact, as early as 1705, when Mazepa and his forces first appeared on right bank Ukraine, Polish territory, the Cossack hetman was contacted by supporters of the pro-Swedish candidate for the Polish throne, the Stanisław Leszczyński. As time passed, it seemed to Mazepa that the future of Cossack Ukraine, which now had suffered certainly since the beginning of the war, so much due to Tsar Peter's military ventures, perhaps Ukraine might best be served by an alliance with Poland, and in particular with Poland's protectors, Sweden. In a sense, Mazepa seemed to be following in the footsteps of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who during the early 1650s also tried to forge a Cossack alliance with Protestant countries in which Sweden would play a leading role. So this was not something new. Nothing, however, was decided upon. All of Mazepa's negotiations were kept secret. Certainly, no plans were made for an uprising against Muscovy. Mazepa continued to remain Peter's faithful servant. External events, however, forced Mazepa to reconsider his position. In August 1706, Charles XII decisively defeats the forces of King August of Saxony, that is Poland, King of Poland, and he then takes the occasion to install his pro-Swedish candidate, the Pole Stanisław Leszczyński, on the Polish throne. Swedes had controlled, again, Warsaw and Krakow. With Poland secured, Charles then led a force of 50,000 men and advanced directly eastward, as you see on the map that I handed out to you, toward Moscow. This was in early 1708. At the very same time as the Swedes are on their way to Moscow, rumors spread that Charles's Polish ally, King Stanisław Leszczyński, was about to attack left bank Ukraine. So now we have Charles up here toward Muscovy, Leszczyński, the pro-Swedish Polish king, supposedly now moving toward the left bank under Muscovy. What does Mazepa do? I mean, he's the hetman of the left bank. He turns to Peter, requesting Muscovite troops to help in the defense of the left bank, the hetmanate. But Peter refused, claiming he had no forces to spare, which might be the case. After all, a 50,000 force of Swedish troops are on the way to Moscow. But in the context of other complaints against the Muscovites, this refusal seemed to Mazepa as a breach of the agreement of protection over Cossack Ukraine that had been entered into by all Tsars since the 1654 agreement of Pereyaslav that Khmelnytsky concluded. At that moment now, in the summer of 1708, Charles XII himself suddenly turns southward toward Ukraine in order to rest and strengthen his army as the first step in a planned sweep around this way toward Muscovy in the north. Tsar Peter responds by dispatching Muscovite troops to intercept the Swedes, and he orders Mazepa to attack them, to attack the Swedish invaders. Now, Mazepa is faced with a dilemma. Should he fulfill the Tsar's orders as he had done so many times in the past? Or should he join Charles in the hope that a Cossack-Swedish alliance might bring peace and political advantages to Ukraine? After delaying several weeks in a desperate attempt to put off the inevitable, Mazepa finally makes his decision in October 1708. The hetman, together with less than 4,000 Cossacks, defects to the Swedes. In return for Mazepa's support and an expected Cossack uprising against Muscovy, Sweden was prepared to guarantee the independence of a Cossack Ukraine on both banks of the Dnieper River. Those two hopes, however, turned out to be illusions. Mazepa had made no plans for a popular uprising, and none occurred. When Peter learned of Mazepa's defection, he was shocked. He could not believe that the 70-year-old hetman, to whom he had remained loyal despite all of those denunciations throughout his entire tenure in Ukraine, that he would have done such a thing. Finally, the Tsar had to believe what happened. His retribution was swift. He ordered the advancing Muscovite army, which was already advancing toward Ukraine to meet the Swedes, to take the hetman's capital, which was a place called Baturyn, right here, almost in the center of Ukraine, of the hetmanate. So he orders his troops to take that capital. It indeed was captured, burned to the ground, all its inhabitants slaughtered. A special court was established to try all remaining supporters of Mazepa. Reportedly, 900 Cossack officers were tortured, found guilty, and executed. During this nightmare, several Cossack informers arose and were richly rewarded for their services against their fellow Cossacks. Finally, several Cossack officers were summoned to another town called Hluchiv, farther north of Baturyn, at the end, in a sense, of the hetmanate territory. And there a new hetman, a man named Kyivan Skoropadsky, was chosen. By the way, the great Russian composer of the 19th century, Pyotr Tchaikovsky, who we hear about this time of the year because the Nutcracker is being performed all over the place, the great ballet that he wrote. Well, this Tchaikovsky's real name, or ancestral name, is Chaika. He is actually of Ukrainian descent, a Cossack, and it was his great-great-grandfather, Chaika, who was among those Cossacks who joined the Muscovite side in this equation. Meanwhile, Mazepa and his followers in the Swedish camp, joined by now an unexpected ally, the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Remember, they had become disillusioned with Muscovy's anti-Tatar policy, and they now also accept the idea of an alliance with Sweden. In May 1709, Charles XII, with Mazepa and now his Cossack allies, a total force of between 22,000 and 28,000, that's the Swedes and the Cossacks, reached the Ukrainian city of Poltava on the left bank of Ukraine. Poltava. This is May 1709. And in July, specifically July 8th, they are met by a Muscovite army with its Cossack allies, numbering a total of 40,000. Peter I led the army. So now we have the two kings against each other. Muscovite forces won a resounding victory. The leading Swedish generals and officers were captured, although Charles XII and Mazepa managed to escape and make their way to the Ottoman Empire. As for Mazepa, he died soon after in Ottoman Turkey. that is within 2 weeks of the Battle of Poltava. Those Cossacks who followed him into exile, eventually led by a man named Pylyp Orlyk, tried to continue the struggle against Muscovy from abroad, that is, now within the framework of the Ottoman Empire. And in a sense, they became the first Ukrainian political emigration. This Battle of Poltava in July 1709 proved to be an important turning point. Sweden's heretofore dominant role in Eastern Europe, especially its influence in Poland, was now coming to an end. And it was not long before Sweden's dominant position in Northern Europe's Baltic lands was taken by the Tsardom of Muscovy under its powerful ruler, Peter I, was soon to be renamed the Russian Empire.